but we can't develop people unless we walk through those consequences with them. And that's a dying to my own self to say, it's not always about efficiency. Welcome back to another episode of the H3X Podcast, where Dave Miller and Mark Gearing, your hosts, discuss the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. Today, we might get a little salty, but we want to revisit a broken record, it seems, which is the idea of habits, but more importantly, how being proactive, getting things rolling and getting started is absolutely crucial and vital for leadership or accomplishing anything when it comes to movement, the Great Commission, the gospel, church planting, multiplying leaders, all of the things that we talk about. Mark, is that a good kickoff?
That's a good kickoff. And you say get salty, and we may, but I think it's like it has so many applications of this need to be proactive, and even examining why I or the leaders that I'm working with may or may not be proactive. Even just the last podcast episode we did was talking about, as we start the year, how do we set goals? We really those are all great, and we all want to be those that set goals and reach our goals. But the reason why we've got to be a broken record on this is it's one thing to set goals. It's one thing to have aspirations, which everybody does, whether you've got a Fortune 500 company or you're 18 and you have like a lot of ideas of where you want to go in your life. But it's the reality is it's having those systems and that leads us to be proactive that really reaches those. So that's why we've got to be a broken record about this, is because I think it's really key for a lot of things that we talk about.
So can we state the obvious and say that you're never going to accomplish a goal if you don't start the process of working towards it?
Yes, sir. That's a good thing to
And
say.
the biggest barrier that we run into repetitively, especially with young leaders, is the process of overcoming procrastination and starting. So what are some ways in which we can take this idea of systems, idea of habits, ideas of proactive, and get started in a way that overcomes that barrier?
Yeah, so some ways to talk about getting started in that. You and I were talking about this before we hit record, and in our last episode, we're talking about setting some goals, and even we started to touch on a little bit of how that system can look in my own life. That quote is so helpful, that you don't really rise to the level of your goals, but we fall to the level of our systems. I believe that's James Clear with Atomic Habits. And it really is true that we can set all these goals, but we're going to fall to the level of our systems. And those systems are not just about, do I have a planner, paper or electronic, or do I have a place to record my thoughts and keep track? Those are all important systems. But part of that, what we're talking about today, and that be proactive, is those systems have got to be internal, and I've got to be committing to taking action in different areas of life, and even seeing myself as somebody that can and should be proactive and not a victim that is waiting for things to just happen to me. So there's a lot of places we could go in there. Where do you want to start, Dave?
Well, yeah, and that's why I said we'll probably get a little bit salty today. And I think one of the places where we might need to get a little salty is on this idea of victim versus proactive. If I'm an entitled thinker, then I just assume certain things should come to me and that I am owed those things. But if I see myself as a contributor and knowing that hard work and that I'm not owed certain things, that I have to get my boots muddy and get to work, changes the dynamic, where if I think that I should just be given something, then I don't work for it. And I'm not going to find the motivation to work for it
Yeah.
because I should just sit around and wait on it. But if I realize, hey, I'm not owed anything, that by the grace of God, I'm going to get to work and then trust him in the process, then we're much more likely to do the things that we talk about, which is get to work, not be afraid of failure, try again, keep going. And so that entitlement mentality is a huge barrier,
Yeah,
Mark. It's a deal breaker when it
it
comes to
is.
leadership, because it causes people to quit too early, and it causes people to not move the extra mile. So let me say it this way. There's no participation trophies in life. There's no C average that moves you to the next grade. It's
Yeah.
done or it's not done.
Yeah.
And if it's not done, that means I have to keep going until it's done.
Yeah. And I think even as we're talking on this subject, there'll be some that listen to this podcast like, well, I don't struggle with that, and I don't even, that doesn't even affect me. But I bet you, or maybe I could even say, I promise you, it's either one leader down from you or a couple leaders down from you, and those that you're leading that are just because that's pretty prevalent in our context here for those that are engaging in North America. I would say probably more broadly than that, but that they
Yeah.
are. And one of the ways that I see that, so if you're like, well, then what does that even look like? The symptom, the evidence of it is often in the language or how we talk about our problems or the things happening in our life. When we use the language of, well, I have to, or my boss is telling me like, this is what I have to do. He's telling me I have to do this, or I don't have a choice. I've got to get this done. I mean, when you find in your language that language of have to, or the it's external to me, all of the control or the motivation versus internal of I get to or I'm going to do this. Usually that comes from a place of either a victim mentality or at very least like reactive posture in your life versus proactive.
And so, as we're developing leaders, as we're mentoring leaders, as we're looking even in our own lives, and we recognize that in our own life, or we recognize that in someone that we're working with, I have a little phrase, a little chart in my house that's called Dad's Wisdom, and they're numbered 1 to 21, and I refer to them often. Number 7 is your choice, your consequences. And one of the things that I'm trying to instill into my own children repetitively is when they make a choice that's going to make them scrape their face on the pavement, I need them to endure their own consequences and not get in the way of those consequences. And I think one of the crucial pieces of mentorship that go along with us helping leaders overcome this barrier of entitlement or overcome the thinking that they're owed certain things
Yes.
is to not rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. Now, there'll be times when we do need to rescue them because they're making a big decision and we know that something could be a wound that's going to make them bow out, and we might need to lessen the blow. But
Yeah.
I would much rather think that we ought to lean on the side of allowing the consequences more than we should lean on the side of trying to curb the consequences. Culturally, for us, especially when it comes to parenting, especially when it comes to the ways in which a lot of the younger people are expecting from their bosses or the ways that they're expecting their parents and those kind of things, is that we're supposed to lessen the blows. And I'm just a firm believer that lessening the blows is actually causing more harm than it is helping, because it's those consequences that really train us to take ownership, to
Yeah.
take responsibility, to change.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dave. I think the only caveat I would say is what you're framing up there is allowing the consequences to lead us, the same thing as we would say in AA, to where we have a problem and we realize, okay, this is an issue, and then ownership happens. But then there is another category of people where they don't have the skills or they don't have the ability to whether they might want to be proactive. But that's another group of people you've even talked about this morning as we were preparing the podcast, of maybe they don't have the ability to have those systems in their life, whether it's like we said, the planner or some sort of external way to process, or it's like that understanding of we're going to fall to the level of our habits that cause us to take action to get started in whatever area.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's both of those categories of people. So if we're starting with just like square one and that person doesn't even realize that they need to take ownership, yeah, they need to experience some of the consequences. Then there's some that are like, hey, I'm doing the best I can, but this is not working, and they're falling on their face. And that's where we get to come in and talk about how to create some of those systems.
And I think, Mark, you're doing a good job of distinguishing about the internal versus the external, using the language that we started off with. If we're recognizing and we're asking for discernment in the leader to say, okay, do we have a problem with motivation? Is it something that's internal where they don't believe or have the perspective or the ownership mentality yet? Okay, then consequences are really important for them to help understand that the consequences are not crises that are outside of me, that these consequences are actually crises that I'm creating because of my own bad choices. And then when we see that change where they're like, I don't want to do this anymore, there's a change of perspective, there's a change of motivation, then
Yeah.
it's really important to start giving skills at that point. Because if we continue to just let consequences be the tutor, then we're going to
Right.
beat them down and they're not going to excel. And so having that understanding of and wisdom and discernment to know when is it a skill thing because they have the motivation, or when is it a
Yes.
motivation thing and they're not ready to accept the skills, because if I'm not motivated, all the skills in the world aren't going to help me. But if I
Right.
am motivated and I don't get the skills, then I'm going to get crushed.
And so I know in some of the recent examples you've been talking about, Dave, of how that's been rolling out with leaders you've been working with, you have some systems in place that are external for those leaders to then experience those consequences of their actions or lack of proactivity that then inspires ownership and leads to some of that that asking for the skills, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting, Mark, is I think in my experience, I've waffled between these two, where you'll see the motivation in a certain area, and then they're in a point where they need the skills. You start giving them skills, some type of an
Yeah.
external thing, whether it be, I mean, and it doesn't have to be crazy. I'll give you a super practical example. When one of the employees that I've been working with, there's a lot of self-made crises that are happening, and it's a result of procrastination. And something as simple as, hey, get a notebook when you have something you know you need to take care of and you can't do it now, write it down and
Hmm.
then get around to it today. Just get around to it. Get started. What we kicked off this podcast with, be proactive.
Yeah.
And that simple little skill of just write it down, be proactive will cause you in the future to not be able to not come to work because you had a flat tire, because you had the spare on, you wrote down, hey, go repair the original tire. You do that, you put it on. Now, 2 weeks from now, you have your spare and you have your original tire and you're going to come to work. So that self-created crisis doesn't happen. All
Yeah.
because of a simple little act. And that was, I wrote down, hey, go get your tire repaired. And then I
Hmm.
took care of that.
Yeah.
So it's not this massive overhaul of life we're talking about. But then I'll go from motivation to skill, and then we'll go from skill back to motivation. And what I tend to find is that then we'll dive down deep and we'll find ourselves hitting up another barrier of perspective, of identity, of just, let's just be honest, sin that just says I don't want to, and then excuses start to pop back out, motivation starts to wane, and then you have to drop back into okay, consequences again,
Yeah.
so that the skills can take their effect. So it's not a
Hmm.
motivation, then skills, then success. It's a
Yeah.
motivation, skills, back to motivation, back to skills, back to motivation. And not too long ago, you shared a image on multiplying disciples in churches on Facebook that was like um, kicking, digging this idolatry of efficiency that we have in the United States, right? Where
Right.
efficiency is everything. How do you think this really plays into the discussion of even us as mentors, where we get frustrated when we aren't efficient in this process and we lose the fact that this is about character development and really about people?
Oh man, I mean, yeah, you're right. It's like the formation of the leader and formation of my own formation as one that is dying to multiplying my life into others. Um, that's the journey that Christ has got us on. So absolutely, it's central. And like what you're saying, I think there is that reality that it's not a linear couple of steps and then now this leader is set up. It's a grind through those different pieces of it, internal to external to internal to external, that then allows that leader to grow. So yeah, 100%.
That meme was funny because you like had these little steps, right? Where it was like,
Yeah.
6 steps and then there's a flag and you're like, woo,
Yeah.
and then six more steps, another flag, and you're like, woo, but everything was a linear, continual, consistent progression to success. And then the second one was like, pits, hills, valleys, way
Yes.
down deep pits, all kinds of
Yes.
things. And it was like, this is God's pathway and God's direction. You get sick and tired of being sick and tired. When it hurts enough that you don't want to be hurt anymore, you say, this has got to change. And someone has to get to a place in an area of their life where they're like, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired here. And I want to change. And it's very important to restate that if someone does not want it, you can't make it happen. I'm like, period. You cannot make someone want something. They have to want it, and we can only respond to that. But as someone who's in their life, we can continually make sure that we don't get in the way of the things that are going to make them get sick and tired of being sick and tired on occasion. Now, here's what's interesting about mentorship, about leadership development, is when you allow other people that are in your sphere of influence, on your team, directly connected to you, endure their own consequences. The truth of the matter is that you're also enduring those consequences with them. And that's where it gets hard, because then you have to pick up the pieces as well. Because if there's something that you've delegated to somebody that needs to happen, and then that doesn't happen, and it needs to happen, then eventually you're going to take a hit for it. And I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers to continually wanting to mentor people. And I'm speaking very personal here, is that you get to the place where you're like, I don't know if I want to endure the consequences of letting people fail anymore in an area where I could have just done it and not had any of the consequences either. But we can't develop people unless we walk through those consequences with them. And that's a dying to my own self to say, it's not always about efficiency. The internal is about motivation, and the internal is about consequences, and the internal is about learning to make the decision to do it because of conviction, passion, aspiration. The external is about putting systems into place that help me to do what you said. The most important thing, get started.
Right.
Be proactive, because my goals are not going to happen if I don't have a system that's going to continually move me towards those goals. And it doesn't have to be a super complicated system. It can be as simple as I have a notebook where I write down what needs to happen next and the simple steps that I need to take to get there. And then I draw a line through each of them as I get them done.
I want to encourage those that may be listening to this as we finish out here. I think what you were saying there, Dave, of learning how to be somebody that is a proactive person that just starts and just takes action. We can't overemphasize that. I think we just got to just keep talking about that piece, because I think that really is the thing that separates those that we think of as successful, or they see some fruit or breakthrough or whatever language you want to use in their life. Most of the time, those people, they started with taking one small step in whatever area that led to more steps, And so even like this podcast that we do, we didn't start by saying like, how are we going to invite these guests and how are we going to approach this topic, and that we just started. We just met up,
right?
Record. What subject you want to talk about first? Let's just take one step and begin to do it, and then that unfolds, right? And that's true of just so many different areas of life. And so I think that's a note I want to leave people on is there's some different like conceptual frameworks to think through of as a leader and one raising up other leaders, the internal and the external. But even that, if you're just saying like, how do we move forward on this? The getting into our mindset, the smallest actions lead to more actions, I think is just a critical piece.
And I'm going to illustrate the shift that has to take place from the childhood, teenage year, college years into let's just use the tradition of mid-20s, early 30s. There's a transition that has to take place. And when you're in school, as an illustration point, and you're given a math test, if you score above a 60 on a math test, that's considered passing.
Yeah.
But when it comes to actual like life and responsibilities, we have to shift from try your best to a mentality of there's not done and done, which I've already mentioned. And what we got to do is we got to go, okay, when there's something that I'm responsible for,
Yeah.
not only do I have to get started on it, but my goal is not just to get 70%, a passing grade. My goal is to get
Good.
it done. And so then it says, if I get 70%, then I don't move on to the next test. I don't move on to the next segment, the next section, the next school year, the next class.
Yeah.
I keep at it until I get 100%.
Yeah.
Right? So if I'm working on a math test and I get 70%, then the mentality would be, using the illustration, is give me that math test again. I'm going to work on it for the next week. And I get 80%. Okay,
Yeah.
give me that math test again because I'm going to work on that for the next week. I'm going to get 95%.
Yeah.
Then it give it to me again and I get 100%. Okay, now I've got it.
Yeah.
Now I can move on. And it's not about just getting to the next new thing. It's about getting the job done. And if the job's not done, then I keep trying over and over and over again until I get it right.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of what we're saying. Not only get started, but being proactive and keep working the system until the system produces done. Then I can move on.
Thanks for listening, for watching. If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.